The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Arab-Israeli strategic realignment and the growing isolation of Pakistan in the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. Chair by Duncan Bartlett. Panelists include MJ Akbar, Dr Ayesha Siddiqa. Please do join us on the 10th of September 2020 at 11 AM UK time and 3:30 PM India time.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today for a discussion of one of the most important and pressing matters in international politics. Is such an important issue is because it has huge implications for India and for the United States and for the allies and friends of those countries, including the United Kingdom. I'm Duncan Bartlett and I'm speaking to you today from London in my capacity as the editor of Asian Affairs magazine. It's a monthly magazine about news and politics, and the theme of our magazine is how the news and events in Asia, or one country in Asia, affect the Asian region. Today we're discussing a rift between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, but it goes much deeper than that because what we're talking about reveals some of the deep divisions in the Asian region and also in the Middle East. Pakistan's approach seems to be to challenge Saudi Arabia's quest for leadership of the Muslim world, and our discussion today will also give us a valuable opportunity to take stock of American foreign policy under Donald Trump, and I expect that it will also raise some questions about the status of Israel. These are big and complex issues, so I'm very pleased to say that we have two people on the panel today who are in an ideal position to help us understand this fascinating topic, and we've invited them here because they're excellent communicators, and I'm sure that they're going to be able to help us to understand this issue better, and I'm looking forward to hearing the insights from them. So on the panel today we have Dr Ayesha Siddiqa, who's a political scientist, author and research associate at SOAS Institute, and also MJ Akbar joins us on the line from Delhi. He's a veteran journalist and politician who previously served as India's Minister of State for External Affairs. And in a minute, I'm going to start by asking our panelists to give us a short presentation, and then we'll move on to some questions and answers. We have an hour in total for our discussion today, and if you're listening in live, please do share your questions and comments with us. But before I hand over to our panelists to give us their opening remarks, I'm going to invite our president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us his opening comments.
As president of the Democracy Forum, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar which we've convened today to examine the growing state of international isolation which has befallen Pakistan. I'd like to thank Duncan Bartlett for agreeing to chair this webinar and to our panelists for participating. For those of you who recently started following our webinars and may not have attended our seminars or indeed read our sister magazine Asian Affairs, Pakistan's failure to develop as a functioning democracy, its role as an existential Islamic state, and its shifting alliances are all a regular feature of our panelists' scrutiny. Following the terrorist attack that shook Kashmir on the 14th of February, the tide of global opinion turned against Pakistan. It was symbolic, perhaps, that 3 days later, when Pakistan ceremoniously repatriated a captured Indian fighter pilot, that the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation chose to be addressed by the Indian Foreign Minister at its meeting at Abu Dhabi, the first time in 50 years, despite protests from Islamabad. A continued sense of the antipathy that has soured Pakistan's relations with erstwhile allies and economic partners in the Gulf was given fresh impetus on August the 5th, when the foreign minister laid down an ultimatum to Riyadh, broadcast live on state television, to support Pakistan's position on the disputed territory of Kashmir. It's worth reminding ourselves, perhaps, that Pakistan is a state founded on a religious precept, the only self-styled Islamic republic in the world, and born, moreover, out of intolerance. I've heard it described as an unstable theocracy constructed from an artificial religious unity. But the very basis of Pakistan's stability as a state was widely debated at the time of its conception. Maulana Azad, one of the few politicians of partition who emerged with his integrity intact, predicted its demise as early as 1946, reminding his audience that an entity conceived in hatred will last only as long as that hatred lasts. And chillingly, he added, this hatred will overwhelm relations between India and Pakistan. Muhammad al-Jinnah, founder of Pakistan, gave a speech in Cairo over 70 years ago, telling his skeptical Arab audience that it is only when Pakistan is established that Indian and Egyptian Muslims will be really free. What Jinnah had not anticipated was the expectation that he inadvertently placed on Pakistan to act as a geopolitical pivot to balance the interests of its diverse neighbours. Indeed, the developments during the first 2 years of Pakistan's existence foreshadowed the path the country would take in subsequent decades. As Hussein Haqqani reminds us, Pakistan actively sought to become a Western ally on the one hand, but embraced anti-Western vocabulary on the other. So it's this fundamental dichotomy which lies at the base of Pakistan's statehood, and which our panelists will be discussing today. It's the very nature of its political instability which justifies the dominance of its military interests and consequently stifles the growth of its democratic institutions. In the last 6 months, however, we've begun to witness the fundamental shift of Pakistan's strategic alliances and a definite oscillation towards the formation of an alternative Muslim hegemony led by Turkey and supported by China. The writer Kunwar Shahid, contributing to an article to The Diplomat last month, suggests that Pakistan's ideal situation would be to rescue some normalcy in its bilateral ties with Saudi Arabia, but at the same time not to relinquish a leading role in a separate Islamic bloc. But Imran Khan's drastic realignment may just be a question of swapping one master for others, while embedding Pakistan at the epicenter of an increasingly tense global polarization. Well, welcome to the webinar, and I hope you very much enjoy listening to our panelists today.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Bruce, for those introductory comments, setting into context a discussion about Pakistan's role in the world and its relationship with other Muslim countries. And now I'd like to hand over the floor to Mr. Akbar in New Delhi for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. There are many aspects to what the subject that we are discussing, but let's start with a very fundamental disconnect that plagues Pakistan and its thinking, not only in terms of its foreign policy, but also in terms of its domestic status and its domestic existence. It has been widely said, and here too it has been repeated, that Pakistan was based, indeed, its progenitor, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, may not have been much of a very good Muslim himself. However, he thought that Islam was sufficient as a basis for nationalism. That was a fundamental misreading of doctrine. Islam is a religion. Islam is a brotherhood. Islam is not and never has been a nationhood. In fact, to reduce Islam to a nationhood would actually mitigate against its existence as an international faith. Now, international faith, whether it is Islam or Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism, has space for many nations. And these nations have different interests. They have different rationales for behavior. And sometimes those interests may cooperate, sometimes those interests may be in conflict. But that has nothing to do with the faith of the people of that particular state. So when Pakistan tries to marry its Islamic avatar Islamic avatar with its political avatar, the disconnect is quite obvious. Now, the disconnect has been papered over by years and layers of rhetoric, which don't really function effectively. We today are moving definitely, and the crises of the 21st century have forced the pace of what I'm going to say. We are moving towards an age of realism in international affairs. And realism really tells you that the first thing you must do is to take off the blinkers. When you get trapped in blinkers, then you can't really see more than in one dimension. Now, the most current, quote unquote, dramatic event has been the normalization of relations between UAE and Israel. Now, here is a very good example of a forward-looking state taking off what had notions that had limited its ability to play its full part in both the region, as well as its ability to expand its and maintain its national interests to for the better good of its people. And now that this has happened, you will see a completely new dynamic operating in what is certainly one of the most dangerous and conflagration-prone areas in the world. I think, just as an aside, we have to now stop calling it the Middle East, a term and a geographically incorrect, and I think strategically incorrect term that has been imposed upon the map by people who only see the map from the West. It is really West Asia that we are talking about. And actually the true Middle East of the East is probably India, which is in the middle of the East. However, this new dynamic that we have seen is actually one that will also play in with another emerging reality, which is actually has been identified and then put into public play by our Prime Minister in a speech, which is that the age of expansionism is over. That countries which seek to actually continue expanding either their literal geographical terrain, or countries that use quasi-colonial attitudes by creating larger space for themselves. The foreign policy of those countries is now actually at a dead end. You're not going to be able to achieve it because the nation state, this is the age of the nation state. The nation state is the principal building block of strategic stability across the world, and every nation state will defend its frontiers and its ability to maintain its capability, and it will not permit encroachment. Third, I think we are moving towards a third dimension in international relations. That for too long we have been trapped by the theories that essentially have emanated from a concept called the balance of power. This is a European concept emerging out of European realities, but it has crept as a mainframe strategic behavior pattern in many, many other contexts. I think what the world needs at this moment is a shift from the balance of power policies towards something far more conducive to stability, to development, to peace, and towards a peaceful future, and that is the power of balance. It's about time that nations understood that they need to think calmly, coolly, and understand that aggression is no longer a sustainable national or international goal. Unfortunately, Pakistan has made aggression into its principal raison d'etre for existence. Now, eventually, such policies don't change anything in the environment, but they do manage to change those who perpetuate and perpetrate these policies. So, aggression is counterproductive, and aggression will actually now injure the aggressor more than it tends to hurt the victim. The Pakistan's approach to the OIC at this moment is actually is seeing the country becoming a sub-player in parallel development, which is the struggle for leadership of the Sunni world. I mean, the de facto leadership of the Shia is with Iran, as we all know that. But in the Sunni world, there is an emerging attempt by Turkey to rebuild its Ottoman space in another name.
I'm wondering actually if Mr. Akbar's screen has become frozen there. Thank you, Mr. Akbar, for joining us from Delhi. I'm hoping that we'll hear more of your insights in just a moment when we reconnect.
Finding your role is not, I'm afraid, going to have too many takers, and it could have serious impact upon the stability of the OIC. Final point, if I may, the OIC needs to remember that there are 200 Muslims, proud Indian and Muslims living in India, right? The OIC has many countries which are not, which do not have a Muslim majority. But the OIC must recognize that India is as much a part of the world where Muslims live as anywhere else.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Akbar. A number of interesting points there. I'm intrigued by your idea that India is the center of the East. What we've been calling the Middle East is now the West part of Asia. And I suppose that still leaves China and Japan and the Korean Peninsula as part of East Asia. But also interesting to hear your thoughts that some countries are taking off their blinkers. And you offered praise there to the United Arab Emirates for its recognition of Israel, despite the controversy that's caused in the Arab world. I'd hope we'll get into some more discussion about that as we move forward. But let's hear now from our other panelist, Ayesha Siddiqa. Ayesha, can I ask you to take the floor, please?
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's indeed a very interesting topic. Let me start with the comments, some of the comments made by my co-panelist, MJ Akbar. He was talking about realism, as if Pakistan is disconnected from the idea of realism. In fact, realism has been very central to its foreign policy making from the very beginning. And it's because of that that in a world post 1947, starting from Jinnah, when a country was created in the name of Islam or for Muslims of South Asia or Muslims of Indian subcontinent, it became very important to link with the Islamic world, to link and explore that identity further. And therefore, part of that realism was that Pakistan connected with the Arab world, and very energetically and very enthusiastically. In fact, what is interesting is that if you look back into history, um, India, which had connections with the Arab world, I mean, till 1958, for example, let's not forget that till 1958, a lot of Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia included used Indian currency. And it was in 1958 and 59 that Nehru very consciously decided to kind of de-link the Arab world from India, and use issues of inflation to argue that in India could not provide those services any longer. Some of the archival material that I've seen in the UK indicates that actually Nehru himself was very conscious and very uncomfortable with connecting with the Muslim world. I mean, the term that is used in these documents is that he didn't want to be encircled by the Muslim world. So for Pakistan, it was very realistic to connect with that identity. What I'm going to do in my 5-10 minutes is look at 4 points. One is Ummah. I mean, how does Ummah evolve? Ummah is a concept. Muslim Ummah is not something static, it has evolved. It remains there in the background. Yes, it's true. And I think in every Muslim country, there is this realization that Ummah is there, it's not there. But it's a concept which remains in the background, which countries connect with every now and then. The other concept is the question of Israel, recognition of Israel. The third is looking at Pakistan and OIC and Pakistan, and finally Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Now, let me very quickly and briefly look at the concept of Ummah, which is Muslim nationhood. Yes, I think it's very clear to a lot of countries, including Pakistan. And this is something which 1980s, during the military government of General Ziaul Haq, who had maximized Islam in Pakistan society. Even there, and then there was a realization that Muslim Ummah just did not deliver. It was not a functioning concept. Yet arguments were built around that, and that continues to be, because if you look at a lot of the Muslim countries are post-colonial states, and you have a lot of places where Muslim populations are in trouble, from Chechnya to Bosnia to Uyghur China to Kashmir and other parts, and there is this sense that every now and then you could bring or invoke the concept of Ummah to discuss and probably get the populations excited. Populations around the world do give attention to this concept. Despite that, it's a very non-functioning concept. So in a way, it's very political in some ways, the concept of Ummah. It's not functional, yet it's functional in another respect. Now, linked to it is the question of recognition of Israel. Yes, it's UAE's recognition of Israel is a very interesting development, and this is the development which is connected with United States and Donald Trump's idea of a peace deal in the Middle East, or West Asia, as Mr. MJ Akbar would like to call it. I mean, I do not have a disagreement with that concept of Middle East being called West Asia. Anyway, so Donald Trump had argued for a peace deal in West Asia, pushing and kind of normalizing relations between Muslim countries, a lot of Muslim countries, key Muslim countries for that matter, and Israel. And the idea perhaps is that this is the way that there could be settlement of the Palestinian issue. The areas which are occupied or which are threatened to be occupied by Israeli state or Israeli forces, Gaza, West Bank, etc. Israel will not, Tel Aviv will not expand its presence there, and instead, so there will be, the Palestinians would be allowed to live there, would kind of have control of the land, and then in return, the quid pro quo is that there will be attacks or there will be peace, and countries around the Muslim world will begin to accept Israel as a reality. Now, what is very interesting is that this is a concept which is, the idea itself has a lot of attraction, even in Pakistan. It's not that Pakistan has tried, Pakistan is one country which has had secret relations with Israel for a very long time. During the 1960s and the 1970s, 70s, Shah of Iran was one of the Muslim leaders who was responsible for kind of communicating between Israel and Pakistan. Pakistan would buy weapons from Israel by Iran. So that has also happened. But there's no diplomatic relations, there are no formal relations. And the question there is that there is, of course, Pakistan's main reservation is the Palestinian issue, which for Pakistan is connected theoretically, conceptually with the Kashmir issue. Then you cannot give up on if you give up on Palestine, that means to give up on Kashmir. That is the idea. However, Pakistan has been tempted many a time. One of the last efforts that were made in this regard was by General Pervez Musharraf. When he went on one of his visits to the US, he addressed the Jewish community there, Jewish Israeli community there, and he sent his foreign minister to engage with the Israeli foreign minister, etc. Yet Pakistan somehow kind of pulls back. It wants to pull back because domestically, it's a very tough question. It's not just a tough question for Pakistan; it's a tough question for the larger Muslim world. Just to give a background, OIC itself was born in 1969 around the issue of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Palestinian issue. So the birth of OIC is very central to how Palestinians are.
Dr. Siddiqa, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Unfortunately, your voice is becoming a little bit difficult to hear because of the position of your microphone. You're becoming a little bit muffled, and that's making it slightly difficult to follow your point there. I wonder if I could just ask you to readjust your position in relation to your microphone to see whether we can hear you a little bit more clearly, please.
Can you hear me now? Is it better
That's
now?
better, yes, thank you.
Yeah, better.
Okay, all right. Okay. So where did you lose me?
Well, I think we're coming towards the end of the opening remarks now. So if I could ask you just to summarize and bring us to your final points.
Yeah, right. So just a couple of minutes. If you could just give me a couple of minutes. So OIC has a background. Now, the thing is, I think OIC has evolved, Saudi Arabia has evolved.
I'm sorry, we're still struggling to hear you clearly there. Could I ask you just to try to adjust the position of your microphone so that we've got a clear sound of your voice? There's a little bit of a muffled sound and a bit of rustling that we're getting at the moment.
I can't help it more than coming closer to the laptop.
I see. Okay. Unfortunately, it's just becoming a little bit difficult for our audience to follow you at the moment.
What do we do now?
Well, perhaps I could just ask you to give your final point, and then we'll perhaps we'll move the discussion on, if that would be okay, please.
Yeah, sure. My final points are that I think in the last few years, the Muslim world has evolved, Saudi Arabia has evolved, and Pakistan's relations with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan's assessment of Saudi Arabia has also evolved. I think the one major issue is that Saudi Arabia, in the context of the Ummah and in context of the Muslim world, has not remained that central. Definitely not for Pakistan. Pakistan would want to move on. OIC, as far as OIC is concerned, OIC will remain. I think there's a realization in Pakistan that OIC does not have the capacity at the moment to deliver as Pakistan would want it to. Pakistan's relations with Saudi Arabia will remain. The two countries need each other. And the problem issue with Pakistan's foreign policy has been that through the decade of the 2000s and 2010 onwards, Pakistan has not really invested in Saudi Arabia as it ought to. So the relationship stands at a point where I think while the two countries are engaged with each other, while OIC is engaged with Pakistan, they're less fundamental, part of the relationship. And one final point is that I don't think that the UN recognition of Israel is like a done deal at the moment. There are a lot of things which UAE has to do. The peace forum in this is a peace and Muslim societies forum in UAE that has gone against the deal with recognition of Israel. And Saudi Arabia, which is a critical country, Muslim country, that itself finds it difficult to recognize Israel. I think Saudi Arabia, my final point is, I don't think that Saudi Arabia can recognize Israel without Pakistan also doing that. So they're in a bind together. That's my final point.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Siddiqa. So a number of interesting points there, and I think it brings us back to where we started, which is how do Muslim countries view their future relationship, if there is any relationship, with Israel? We've talked about the process by which the United Arab Emirates has come to diplomatically recognize Israel. That's obviously led to a pushback by Pakistan. Donald Trump's nephew, who's been involved in this process, has said that it's inevitable that Saudi Arabia will now move forward and recognize Israel, following the lead of the United Arab Emirates. That would be a big geopolitical shift. Let's ask MJ Akbar, what do you see as being the next stage in this process? Do you think that there will be wider diplomatic recognition within the Arab world for the state of Israel, and how does that leave the question of the Palestinians?
Well, we must never forget that the two countries adjacent to Palestine, which is Egypt and Jordan, already have diplomatic relations with Israel. So, they have managed to have ambassadors and a working relationship with Israel and square that off with their view on how the Palestine issue should be resolved. One thing is very clear, that, the days of believing, for some reason, that you could actually have a solution to the Palestine problem without accepting Israel, those days are over. So now it's a question of finding the right parameters by which we can now create a viable and sustainable coexistence. On the other side, what we are seeing is very, very interesting. What we are seeing is that the country which actually was created as the first Islamic state now finds itself incompatible with the Organization of Islamic Countries and Islamic Cooperation. So the tensions that are emanating out of very important geostrategic shifts, the tremors that are emerging out of there, are actually leading to very cracks in existing existing frameworks. To some extent, this is inevitable because countries which take an ostrich view of the world, that I love the sand and my head shall remain permanently ensconced in this sand, are bound, if they ever can see around them, to find that the world has become a different place when they finally, occasionally lift their heads out of this sand. I think this is something that Pakistan's leaders need to understand, not for anyone else's good, for their own good. But given the track record and given the rhetoric that we hear at this moment, it seems highly unlikely that this will happen. And indeed, I think that Pakistan might be the last, if that, country to join the age of realism.
Thank you. And I'd be interested to dig a bit deeper in there. I mean, whether or not this is just a rift between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, or whether it's an irreconcilable crack between Pakistan and the Organisation of Islamic States. We've got a question from Lisa Thorne at Together Global. Do the panel agree that US policy to support Arab-Israeli alignment is born out of America's personal interest, or is there a strategic or ideological reason behind it? This is about Trump's policy towards the Middle East. Dr. Siddiqa, what's your perspective on this? Is this being driven by the White House, do you think?
Well, it's partly the White House, but on a strategic scale. I think that's United States searching for kind of a rapprochement between Palestinians living there, and firstly, Palestinians and in the Israeli state. Secondly, trying to find a way to push back Iran or Hezbollah and Hamas, the militant organizations, out of the conversation. And basically saying that, all right, here are these bunch of Muslim countries which will now recognize Israel, have diplomatic relations, and as a result, there will be lesser violence, possibility of lesser violence in between Palestine and Israel, and adjustment of Palestinians by the Israeli state. Now, whether this is going to happen, it's a different question. And referring to the very poetic conversation by my fellow panelist, Mr. MJ Akbar, and constantly talk about realism. I think realism just doesn't have one face. It's also a fact that Palestine or Israeli state will concede to or will create greater room for Palestinians living there if it appreciates or understands that there is a cost or there's a benefit of doing that. So every country has their own assessment of where the cost and benefit lies. And therefore, Pakistan's assessment has been different on that.
I think the question from the audience was: Is this something which is being driven by the United States? Is the United States?
I've answered the question. I have answered the question.
Okay, so Mr. Akbar, where do you think this leaves the question of the Palestinians? Because from what I hear from many Muslim organizations is that they perceive this as being a unifying issue for Arab and Muslim countries, and it's actually coalescing around the Palestinian cause, which has brought countries which have got very different approaches to government together into this organization. If they now split over how they see Israel and the issue of the Palestinians, is that going to cause regional conflict and tension, do you think?
Is this driven by the American self-interest or not? First, to answer that question, we'll have to decide what is the present American self-interest. Is American self-interest at the moment geared towards conflict, or is it geared towards finding a peaceful resolution? Right now, the track record at this moment shows that there is an effort to get a peaceful resolution in place and to keep out of conflict. Perhaps not least because the American experience in Iraq has shown how expensive involvement in conflict can be, even for the world's wealthiest country and for the world's biggest history's biggest superpower. So I think if this
So I think we've lost Mr. Akbar's line to Delhi there. He's frozen for a moment there. Let's go back to Dr. Siddiqa then. I mean, in terms of Pakistan at the moment, how do you think foreign policy...
sorry, I said the interest of two other countries, which is one is UAE.
Let's come back to Mr. Akbar shortly. Let's go to Ayesha Siddiqa again. Pakistan's foreign policy, who's setting it? Because it's notable, isn't it, that we're hearing different voices on what Pakistan should do and its relations with the Organisation of Islamic Countries. Sometimes different coming from Imran Khan, sometimes different coming from the foreign minister, and then a military general was sent to Saudi Arabia as part of the discussions. So what's the driving force behind Pakistan's foreign policy at the moment? Is it the civilian government or is it the military?
Well, traditionally, Pakistan's foreign policy has been set by the GHQ. So, and with this government, Imran Khan government, they seem to be on the same page. So I don't see a difference between the typical tension that you find under previous governments with the GHQ on foreign policy issues. That you don't find in case of this government. This government is squarely following what GHQ wants it to do. So firstly that, but as far as this question of Israel and Saudi Arabia is concerned, relations with Saudi Arabia are concerned, I do not see any tension there. It's basically, I don't think that the foreign minister was alone in expressing an anger, showing aggression on verbal aggression regarding Saudi Arabia. I think this was a general sentiment. There's a general sentiment in the Foreign Office, in the GHQ and the civilian government that Saudi Arabia is in no position to dictate to Pakistan, firstly. And secondly, the tension between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, recent tension, has got nothing to do with the recognition of Palestine. I thought we were talking about that issue in your program. It's to do with Pakistan getting a sense, firstly, that it has kind of completely, in a way, lost Saudi Arabia. Lost Saudi Arabia in a very tactical way, not in a strategic way. I mean, the two are still very connected. And it's like battling for a little more space. And secondly, there is a recognition in Islamabad that as far as Kashmir is concerned, not about Palestine, as far as Kashmir is concerned, I don't think that OIC intends to, or Saudi Arabia intends to play a role, and therefore, since Saudi Arabia has become less significant for Pakistan, that's the nature of relationship at the moment. So, the military and civilian government, this particular civilian government, are on the same page.
Thank you. So let's think about that question perhaps from a different perspective, which is, I think, one about the nature of democracy and how that affects decision making at a governmental level, including in terms of foreign policy. Are we right to conclude that there is a shortage of there's a weakness in the democratic process across these Middle Eastern countries, which is affecting the way in which they behave towards one another and indeed towards Israel and the United States? Is that an oversimplification, Mr. Akbar?
Well, maybe that is an oversimplification, because when it comes to the national interest and when it comes to foreign policy, which is an expression of the national interest, I don't know at which point in my previous intervention I got lost, but I did say, and I repeat, that what is happening now in terms, if you describe it in terms of self-interest, then it is not simply American self-interest which is involved. It is the UAE self-interest and Israel self-interest, which are coalescing into a pattern, which is a triangle of self-interests looking for space for cooperation. And we must assume, I certainly know that UAE has a very enlightened government, which will think many times before it does anything as important as this, and it will do it with consultation of its friends. The question of whether a democracy actually creates a more quote-unquote genuine foreign policy or not, I think really is more theoretical than practical, because whoever runs a nation, and this is we have seen from in practical reality, that whoever runs a nation, while the domestic character of a government definitely is affected by whether it is a democracy or not. In terms of foreign relations, I mean, why does nobody mention the fact that China has not been a democracy ever from the time of Mr. Adam, right, till today? But nobody has ever accused China of not pursuing its national interest, sometimes far too excessively. I think I belong very proudly to a democratic nation, and we shall never ever compromise on our rights, freedoms, and democratic values. But when it comes to, we had a period of absence of democracy, which was in 1975 to 77, and that period of the emergency when there was, dictatorship, Indian foreign policy was not affected. So I think, we should possibly, while we all want democracy, we should possibly keep the two separate.
Thank you. I wanted to just go back a little bit on this question about the relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. I mean, some people just see this as being a rift that's been provoked over the question of the recognition of Israel, but I also see Kashmir as being absolutely central to this. Clearly, Pakistan had been hoping that the rest of the Muslim world would see the Kashmir question from the Pakistani perspective. My feeling, editing Asian Affairs magazine, is that Kashmir has slipped down the international agenda since Mr. Modi introduced that security clampdown last year. Of course, it's been criticized by Muslim countries, but it's not getting the international attention that it was. So do you think, Dr. Siddiqa, that this is to do with a situation which is being affected by the India-Pakistan disagreement over the status of Kashmir?
The tension between, firstly, very quickly, the tension between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan has got nothing to do with recognition of Israel. Both Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are in a bind as far as that particular issue is concerned. So be it Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, they find it difficult as yet. I mean, you mentioned Jared Kushner perhaps talking about Donald Trump's son-in-law, talking about Saudi Arabia being next in line to recognize Israel. I think Saudi Arabia is not anywhere close to recognizing Israel. That will take a while. Secondly, coming to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, I think firstly, there is a history of what's happening between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Pakistan has been losing Saudi Arabia since the decade of the 2000s. Because Pakistan's foreign policy revolves around India, unfortunately, which is it wants to push India back. And therefore, Saudi Arabia has been getting closer to India since 2000s. There have been several visits. King Abdullah visited India. Prime Minister Modi has gone to visit Saudi Arabia. So there is all of that. Now the thing is that while Pakistan was concentrating on Afghanistan, on terrorism issues, it completely disinvested intellectually from Saudi Arabia. It just did not. It took it for granted that there is a relationship that will be. And so we come to a point with the Modi government, which has taken a very interesting step of investing in the Middle East or West Asia, and actually investing in relationship with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and number of Arab states. Now, as opposed to that, and therefore, as a result of that, Kashmir has become less significant in OIC's agenda. Now, that doesn't mean that Kashmir is not being talked about by other Muslim countries. Now, one of the reasons I discussed the whole concept of, try to discuss the conceptual concept of Ummah, is that the fulcrum of Ummah itself may have shifted away from Saudi Arabia to somewhere else. It may have shifted to Turkey, to Malaysia, to Iran, to other countries which are willing to talk about Muslim problems or problems of Muslim population. So you'd hear about Kashmir in Iran, you'd hear Malaysia talk about it. In fact, Malaysia did a major step that it kind of sacrificed its trade interest with India, its palm oil trade with India, because of talking about Kashmir. So there are countries, Muslim countries, which continue to talk about Kashmir. There are Muslim countries which will continue to talk about Palestine. So yes, UAE has recognized Israel, but that's one step. There are a lot of things which are yet to happen. There isn't a consensus. There wouldn't be consensus as a result of that, which will develop. That's my point.
Thank you very much. That's a very useful point to make. Well, we're drawing towards the end of the time that we have here. Clearly, a huge question like Kashmir is not something that we'll be able to get into in any depth at this point. But I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa from SOAS and MJ Akbar joining us live from New Delhi. Before we go, I would like us to hear a contribution from a British politician who's extremely supportive of Democracy Forum, and that's the British Labour MP Barry Gardiner. Barry.
Until recently, Israel had full diplomatic relations with only two of its Arab neighbours, Egypt and Jordan, and those date back to the peace treaties established in 1979 and 94, respectively. So the diplomatic relations agreement that the Trump administration announced on the 13th of August, heralding the normalization of diplomatic relations between the UAE and Israel, has to be regarded as significant. But how? This is not just the two countries establishing embassies and beginning to cooperate on tourism and trade. The key element of the agreement is the strengthening of the security relationship, and that means an eye to Iran. the Sunni Arab states and Israel on one side, and Shia Iran on the other. You can say that this is not entirely new. Israel has been quietly cooperating with other Sunni Arab states for a while. The significance is that this is formalized. That formalization is key in enabling the UAE to find buying arms from the US much easier. The US view is normalize relations with Israel, and you can no longer be viewed as a threat. What does Israel gain? To understand this takes only 3 words: West Bank annexation. The joint communique issued by Israel, the UAE and the US on the 13th of August linked the agreement between the UAE and Israel to Israel's plan to annex much of the occupied Palestinian territory on the West Bank. And the communique said, as a result of this diplomatic breakthrough and at the request of President Trump with the support of the UAE, Israel will suspend declaring sovereignty over areas outlined in the President's vision for peace. However, the Arabic language version of the communique used a word that means stop rather than suspend. And that didn't go unnoticed by the Palestinians, but they were fobbed off by a spokesman for the UAE Foreign Ministry who said that the word was the nearest possible Arabic translation of suspend. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was quite clear, though, in his televised address of the 13th of August. He said, "There is no change to our plans to apply sovereignty over Judea and Samaria in coordination with the US. I remain committed to that." So where does this all end up? Could there be further formalizations of normalizations? Well, in his statement, Trump said, "We're already discussing this with other nations, with very powerful, very good nations, and people that want to see peace in the Middle East. So you will probably see others of these, but this is the first one in more than 25 years. Well, whether there will be any other countries in the Gulf prepared to make the move isn't yet clear, but Bahrain and Oman quickly welcomed the move. The Bahraini government is highly invested in the struggle against Iranian influence and would probably see a Gulf-Israel front against Iran as beneficial. So if other Gulf states do decide to normalize, Bahrain could well be the first. Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they made no official comment on the announcement. And Saudi Arabia's decision would of course be the most significant, but the ruling elite appears divided. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has suggested normalization with Israel, but his father, King Salman, of course, he remains committed to the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which offered to exchange land for peace, a two-state solution, and Arab normalization. So, what does the US gain, or rather, what would President Trump gain? First, the deal shows that despite his stated intention 4 years ago to dedicate fewer resources to the Middle East, the US is still highly influential there. Add this to the relocation of the US Embassy to Jerusalem, the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which were seized from Syria in 1967, and the Palestinian territories annexation plan, and what you have is a compelling pitch to the huge vote bank of American evangelical Protestants that he needs to win the US election in November. It's just possible that I'm overly cynical, because Robert Satloff for the Washington Institute writes that the deal is a good one, though not as important as the Egypt and Jordan treaties. He says that the Trump administration realized that annexation would kill any hopes of a deal on the Palestinian question. So Netanyahu was offered the UAE deal as really a way to climb down from the annexation plan. Maybe. But I suspect that Nathan Sachs of the Brookings Institution may have got it just about right when he says that the deal is pretty good for Israel and the UAE, but the Palestinians are the losers. The impatience in the Gulf with the Palestinians now comes to full daylight. The Gulf won't wait for them any longer, asking of Israel only to avoid declarations of a major change to the status quo. And one factor in the Gulf's distancing from the Palestinians is the rise of political Islam in the form of Hamas, that has tied the fate of the Palestinians to the region-wide power struggle between supporters and opponents of political Islam. Salam Fayyad, the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, well, he's dismissed the deal, saying, "Little did Arab leaders know when they adopted the Arab Peace Initiative some 18 years ago that normalization for withdrawal from the occupied Arab territories would turn into normalization for a mere suspension." Read, barely temporarily refraining from committing another egregious violation of international law. That's his view. So, there we have it. Politics, they say all politics is domestic, and certainly for Israel, for the UAE, and for the US, at least for the President of the US, I think it has all boiled down to very clear domestic considerations.
Much for that contribution. Well, we're nearly out of time today with the Democracy Forum, but let me tell you about our next event. That's going to be held on Monday, September the 22nd, and it's going to be a discussion about China. Is it right to view China as a challenge to the international order? We have some excellent panelists, including the BBC's China editor, Howard Zhang. But for today, that's all from the Democracy Forum. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much for you, to you for taking part and sharing your ideas with us.